Okay, everybody, welcome. We're going to get started. I see a few people walking in. Give it one more minute. And please feel free to come up to the front. We have some extra space up here. I feel like it's in college when everybody'd sit in the back and try to avoid me. So hi, everybody. I'm Naveen Murthy. I'm with Syneos Health. Thank you and welcome. For the next hour, we're going to be talking about investment from the perspective of an emerging company. So I'm with Syneos. I have my colleagues here, Sachin Purwar, as well as Michael Sarshad. We've been leading up the charge on our thought leadership on emerging company launch. Actually, last year at JP Morgan, we ran a similar session, and I think I see a few familiar faces. And the whole genesis of this thought leadership was we work with a lot of emerging to mid-sized companies that are trying to figure out how much should they spend, how quickly, early in commercialization they should spend. And so we've generated a set of thought leadership, and I'll walk through some of the pieces of that we've kind of built upon, starting from a couple of years ago up to some recent survey work that we've done this year. Okay? For those of you that are not familiar with Syneos, so we're a fully integrated clinical and commercial service provider. And then from the three of us are representing the consulting side of our business as well. So again, thank you very much for coming. Let me get going. Okay. Before we actually get into the content, just with a show of hands, actually, how many people here have previously launched a product? Okay. And how many are you in the process right now, your first time going through it in the development stages? Okay, so we have a mix there, and so hopefully this will provide some perspective. We really want this session to be a good executive exchange. So we have quite a bit of information and data here, but I'd also love for there to be discussion amongst all of you as we go through the next hour or so. Okay, so the genesis again was the question that we get quite a bit is how much should we spend in the pre-launch period, and then ultimately we took that to the next level of how does that actually tie to launch success? And as part of that, we have three core areas that we've generated some data, and we're going to read a lot of this out to you today. The first is an in vivo white paper that we had put out about a year ago, as part of which we did an objective analysis of a set of companies. I'll go into the methodology coming up. And we focused on the SG&A spend of these companies and then tied it to the level of success and how we've defined success is relevant to the forecast. And actually, in this case, it's an analyst forecast for the product. We'll get into some of the methodology in a little bit more. We have two other areas. One was at the JP Morgan last year, we ran a similar exercise, and as part of that, we had a roundtable in a little bit of a different format, but we were able to generate some new ideas and had some really colorful discussion, and for that, we have some of the outputs. And then lastly, we've actually run a series of surveys at Biotech Showcase the last couple of years. Really insightful data. We have a mix of financial perspectives as from financial services advisory as well as from biopharma leadership. So we have some of the data that we share here will also hopefully give different perspectives on what we've seen. So over the next hour, we're going to first focus a little bit on the data that we generated through our thought leadership article. And then we've broken this into a few different, and you can feel free to come up here if you need some space, into a few different topics. One is around launch forecasting and really looking at the difference of analyst forecasts versus corporate internal forecasting. We'll then get into break-even analysis, something that we are speaking with leadership quite a bit in the biopharma space. It's around how long does it take to actually hit that break-even and start to show positive cash flow from that first launch asset. So we'll get into that a little bit. Next is timing, level, and key factors or drivers of SG&A spend. And then lastly is other key areas of focus where we've actually gone through, and actually this is through one of the most recent surveys, is understood where levels of investment are underfunded at the functional level throughout the course of a launch period. Okay. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. But please, as we go through this, feel free to ask questions and have a discussion amongst yourselves as well. Okay. So for the first 15 minutes or so, or 10 minutes, going to go through the launch article that we put together and some of the methodology, because it is important for you to understand how we built this. The first was we looked at some core financial metrics, doing a review of publicly available information. And these metrics were the SG&A spend that companies provided, an SG&A spend as for the first product launch. And these are going to be tied to really what their commercialization spend is. This is separate from development spend, which we noted would be kind of more reflective of what their pipeline investment is. And then we also looked at, from a geographic perspective, the companies in the set were primarily US-based. There were some ex-US companies, but the analysis at least ties a little bit more to the US marketplace. From target companies that we looked at, these were biopharma companies, so they weren't directly med device companies, is one thing that we did not include. This was first launch products. So this was what allowed us to differentiate and didn't get intermingled with any other launching products for that particular company. We needed company financials that were publicly available. Again, we were doing this as objectively as we could from that perspective, and that these were for therapeutic products. But the most important one here is that these were the first launches. So the first area that I'd like to key you into is the level of SG&A spent in the year prior to launch. And we put this as a tie-in to the level of success as we measured against analyst forecast. And so if we look at the left side, just to give you a sense, the 75% is the level of SG&A spend in the year prior to launch relative to the first year forecast from analysts. And that is the core measure that we've looked at throughout this analysis. And what we found is that no company that did not spend up to the 75% threshold actually was successful relative, again, to the analyst forecast for the first year. So I'm going to pause there because some people, and when I'm going back to even the presentation last year, one of the questions was, well, is there a better measure than analyst forecasts? First off, we don't have access to all the company financials, so we needed something that would be objective. And another element, and we're going to play this theme throughout here, is that analyst forecasts, at the end of the day, they're a very important metric also for future success of the company, because that's what the company is often being measured against. Okay, so this is, again, for the first year. And what we also see, if you look at the red, so these are the ones that were not successful, you also see, when you actually get all the way to the right, a couple that were unsuccessful. And the reason there is, at some point, companies are just not able to make up the success of maybe a product that has not been designed well, or other factors, and we'll speak to that coming up. So some of these might have been companies almost trying to throw money at trying to solve an issue. Okay. Any questions on this? Because this is going to serve as a foundational data point.
And one comment that we want to make to clarify why we chose the launch year forecast, and there's two primary reasons. The first one is that we didn't have peak data for a lot of these because you saw the launch time frame here. So what that means is that we weren't able to finally see what the peak was for many of these companies. So that was just a metric that we could not use. Sorry. That was just a metric that we couldn't use. The second reason is that, at least for the first 3 years, the companies that didn't hit their first year forecast were very unlikely to catch up at that point. So this just underscores the importance of hitting that first year mark.
Okay. Going forward, so that was focused on just the year prior to launch. We then actually said, well, what does it look like if we pull it up a little bit and see how are these companies performing if they're spending more or less in the few years running up to launch. We see often from a commercial perspective, a lot of the first commercial spend for an organization is starting about 3 years prior to launch. Again, it depends on the therapeutic area and the product, but that's where we're starting to see a lot of the spend start. And if you look at the companies in the red, again, these are the ones where they did not achieve the analyst forecast, you see the numbers in the 20%, 40% range prior to launch. So they really maximize their level of investment from an SG&A perspective at that 38%. But if you look at the successful launches, and we're talking magnitudes larger, where not only do they spend a lot more in the peri-launch period, if you actually look at the L-3, which is 3 years prior, and L-2, which is 2 years prior, they are significantly outspending the unsuccessful companies as well, suggesting that earlier spend is also one of the more critical attributes. And we'll get into some of the drivers of this coming up. But again, I'll take a pause here if there are any questions. Yes?
Is there critical exclusion or inclusion to the SG&A itself that you did? I know you only went with public companies, but SG&A is a big bucket
Yeah.
of a company. So what was the, or you just took whatever they reported at face value?
What we wanted to do is get the most consistent approach. Quite honestly, when we went into this exercise, we scanned to see if there was any existing data that actually measured up, and there wasn't. The SG&A is how the data is often reported that allows us to do this analysis. And it is pretty representative. It includes all the activities that are being done and includes the FTEs that are being used. Again, it's not the absolute numbers, and we are going to share absolute numbers here coming up. So the absolutes, could vary a little bit from reality, but from a general foundational view, it's pretty spot on to what you would expect. Any questions? So from an absolute perspective, this did not. There we go. So on the left side is the mean SG&A spent by all companies in this data set. So there were 19 companies that actually qualified based off of those inclusion-exclusion criteria that we shared at the beginning. And of those 19, we look at the left side, and the spend, which is 3 years prior to launch, all the way through and including the launch year, the average spend was around $185 million. If you actually look at the pre-launch period, the 3-year run-up, the average it's about $100 million, a little under $100 million. You can see the variances here from the lower and upper ranges that we saw. We did not divide this by successful and unsuccessful, but wanted to give a range because the absolutes are what we're also often asked about, and so this is hopefully kind of a helpful foundational set of SG&A spend over that period. Any questions on that? Surprising? Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, please.
Is this a mix of different regulatory pathways, like NC versus 505(b)(2) versus?
And this includes, yeah. This is a mix of, so there were 19 companies included. This includes some even rare disease companies versus larger oncology. So it is a mix. When we actually did break it out between a couple of different metrics, oncology, rare disease, and looking. Quite honestly, they're about pretty close. They're certainly, if you're doing a 505(b)(2) or something, you're going to have, as you would expect, a lower level of spend for some of these, or maybe a smaller rare disease where you have less customer touch needed, the breadth, that would be lower as well. The next one I wanted to highlight is the level of launch experience that the leadership has, interestingly, does have a pretty direct correlation to how much they're spending. So we go from left to right here, 3 years prior, 2 years prior, and then the year prior to launch. If you just look at the top row, I want to get your eyes on looking at the upper right corner where we have the 10%. That blue color is actually, when you start looking at the rest of the chart, is where I would like your eyes to go, because what that's getting at, that blue is where the threshold is above the 75% that we've talked about as being successful. So if you look at 3 years prior to launch, an executive who has one launch, none of them said that they expected to have spent more than the threshold. If you actually look at 2 years prior, same thing. Only when you get to the year prior to launch did a minority of the executives say that they had planned to spend at least that minimum threshold that we saw. As you go down this chart and you see 2 years and 3 years of launch experience, you actually start to see that number change a little bit. You still see a lot of underinvestment, which is pretty much any of the orange, red colors is underinvestment. But what you start to see is, with 2 launches of experience, you're actually starting to see in the 2-year prior window, about a third, almost a third of them, starting to actually hit that threshold spend. And then when you actually look at 3 years, you're starting to see the level of spend actually pull up all the way into 3 years prior. So what we're reading from this is the more experience you have, you start to realize, I need to spend more earlier. It's still not getting to the level that we saw as driving a successful launch, but you're at least starting to see that start to play in. Any questions on that? Okay. We're now going to talk through some of these 4 topics that we've identified here. And some of the themes that we just talked about will carry through the rest of the discussion. So the first that we'll go into is going to be around launch forecast expectations. And this is where we're actually comparing analyst forecasts to internal forecasts and trying to look at level of achievement of the forecast. Okay? So in the pie chart that we have, we asked, and this is actually the most recent data we got from the survey that we conducted over the past few weeks. We asked the level of achievement of the biopharma executives' forecast, and what we saw is about 71% said they actually achieved their forecast versus the 29% that we have. We actually also looked to see, does that level of achievement vary based on the size of the product opportunity? And we actually saw a pretty big variance there, meaning we did not see any direct correlation. But one thing that we're going to carry forward here is, while 71% here said that they were successful, on one of our previous slides we had talked about there's a 42% number that we looked at. When we looked at the overall, those 19 companies, only 42% of them actually hit the analyst forecast. So we're seeing a pretty big disconnect there between an internal forecast and achieving that versus an analyst forecast and achieving that. And that is something where that theme is something we want to carry forward, and we actually want to ask all of you a little bit about, because if the street is thinking one thing and the internal forecast is different, what are opportunities to actually get those closer, to tell the story a little bit differently so that we can get a little bit closer? Before we go into that question, if we're saying that about 42%, or actually we've done a separate analysis where we saw 45% were achieving forecast, meaning the majority were missing. We have drivers here, and we actually had pulled separately, I think it was 119 biopharma leaders, about reasons for missing forecast. And I'm sorry, that's messed up there. And we have 7 items here. These are not prioritized, but these were the ones that came up most frequently. So the first is lack of meaningful clinical evidence. And the context behind that is often the product is actually being developed, but not with the commercial mindset in mind, so that it's not pulling forward enough of the commercial insight. So really needing to hear from the customers earlier in the product development to ultimately set the product up for future success. Second was the inability to prioritize customers or understand their preferences. Somewhat tied to the first point here, but it's really lack of detailed market understanding, as well as lack of ability to really focus. Is one of the key items there. Delay in regulatory approval, I mean, pretty straightforward on that. It happens. Some companies can kind of prepare for that in a little bit more effectively than others. Unrealistic forecast, which I'm sure some of you that have launched have dealt with in the past. Inadequate value proposition and payer coverage. So one of the other themes that you're going to hear from here, and then we'll be talking about a little bit more, is the level of focus on market access and the payer value proposition. This is an element where we're seeing biopharma executives say that they've had a lot of misses and have not prepared for that effectively enough. That does also tie to the number one, which is the lack of meaningful clinical evidence. Unprepared supply chain is the sixth one. This is one where a lot of organizations feel that they do have their supply chain in order, whether it's the manufacturing, whether it's actually once it's manufactured, but get the trade part of it, so getting it out to the customer. But what we're seeing and hearing is a lot of examples of that actually not being the full preparation that was expected, especially as part of a first launch. And then lastly is poor launch execution due to a lot of what we've been talking about around either inadequate spending or delayed spending. So hopefully these are kind of, for those of you that have launched, maybe you've seen some of these come through in your launches, and we're going to talk about that momentarily. Any questions on these?
Why didn't you rank them?
Why didn't we rank them? This was just the full list. We just didn't rank them. We can follow up on that and see if we can pull the order. Yeah. Okay.
So for each of these key topics, what we want to do is have a discussion here because we want to understand your experiences. And for the first one, for the forecast for actual revenue, we saw what the disconnect was between the analyst forecast as from the internal forecast. So what we want to understand is, what do you think are some of the drivers of disconnect there? It could be obviously people taking the survey saying they want to be successful and aren't going to be, 100%. I don't want to say truthful, but maybe they're fudging the numbers a little bit. That could be part of it. But the other part could be just that maybe the analysts have maybe there's just a lack of communication between the company and the analysts. So what's happening is they're setting unreasonable expectations, and the perception is that your company is not successful. So I just want to understand from any of you in the audience that had some of this experience, what do you think some of those drivers are for the disconnect?
Pipelines, acquisitions that aren't disclosed. There's a lot of stuff that goes on that's not, no transparency.
Also, like with the management outlook, it's like calling the baby ugly, right? It's so the expectations internally could be very different than what the market would see it as.
But if we're seeing the internal expectations as being a little lower than the market, is there anything that executives could do differently to make sure that that's...
Well, I don't know if it's anything that's going to be... I think it's a difference in perception, right? So the market, the analysts see the potential, but on the management side, it takes real work, pragmatic work to recreate a market and to actualize innovation. So what is potential and what is actualized are two different things. So there are not many people that can actualize the potential. So the potential for the molecule and creating the market are two different things.
So kind of going off of that, right? We heard a couple of good comments out here, but what can biopharma executives do differently to ensure that that communication is there? Because if analyst forecasts are unrealistic, which is causing the less companies to hit that forecast, what can biopharma executives do differently to make sure that analysts understand the potential, the challenges to hit that number, and making sure that they're at least setting the market or setting the right expectations for the street?
So I think it's bigger than the drug itself, because true innovation requires a reconstruction of the ecosystem. So it's bigger than just that drug launch. So, I think there's realistic sort of parameters that are put into that. But, I think there is a disconnect between actualization and idealization.
But so I guess just to maybe if we can elaborate a little more, but how do you think you can change that? I mean, there could be that realistic disconnect, but if you're being truthful about what your forecast is, and if you've done your diligence in the market, and you maybe have some conservative expectations, how do you make sure that that's communicated appropriately?
Well, I think, you don't want to overpromise and underdeliver, because the worst thing a biotech company or pharma company can do is project higher numbers and not deliver on it, because then their stock prices decrease.
Yep.
So it's actually not wise to do that. It's actually not wise to say that you're going to hit high numbers and then not deliver on it. It's wiser to project lower numbers and to exceed them.
Yeah.
And then your stock prices are going to increase. So it's
Yeah.
actually not smart to do that.
Yeah,
I
but-
wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah, but we're seeing the opposite, right? So that's what it's pretty interesting.
But I think it's also, I think I'm loud enough. It's the common sense that the analysts cannot know better than you,
Yeah,
right? It's your molecule or it's 505(b)(2. You know it inside out, so it's your burden to educate them why these numbers are the way they are, right?
Yeah.
Instead of and put it in the layman, they might sometimes misread to what you're saying. So it's an education, like when you introduce a new dosage form or when you introduce a new molecule, you educate the patient. You need to educate the analyst.
yeah, that's true. And I think and you'll see later too, that we're seeing that executives wish they spent more time on PR and communications as part of their launch as from what they actually do. So that's a great point. I think we're
Okay. Thank you for that, Sachin. We're not going to go into break even. One of the questions we get quite frequently is, how long does it take to actually turn cash flow positive for the first launch asset? And so we actually asked the question recently to some of the participants, actually maybe some of you here today, to understand how long you expected to actually turn cash flow positive from the first launch, and then what the actual was. So on the upper left here, we have the expected time to cash flow positive, and you can actually see the responses. Most of them kind of in the 2 to 4 year, 2 to 5 year window. Looking at the average, it was actually 3.2 years. We then also asked what was the actual, and the actual was actually not that far from that. It was 3.5 years is what they had actually achieved. And then in the upper right, we actually asked, based off of their expectations, did they actually achieve them or not? And so about 3/4 or so actually did achieve their time. And so when we look at that, the ones that actually did not achieve, it was most of the ones in the early years. So the ones in the 2 years, those actually, even though they expected to try to do that, most of those did not achieve that 1 to 2 year break even, which is probably not very surprising because that's pretty quick. But that is at least what the data are telling us there. Yes?
Is that without a transaction?
This was just straight up if they were developing it, yeah.
So all 19 had no transaction? Did you have to exclude because they had a transaction?
So anything that did have a transaction was excluded after the fact, yeah.
So I guess, Michael, you're going to lead these questions?
Sure. I mean, I think that is a great follow-up to ask, just general pulse in the room. I mean, how does that sound? What are your general thoughts hearing that, on average about 3.5 years was a break-even point? Does that seem low? Does that seem high? Does that seem about right? Seeing a couple nods. Anyone think that's too aggressive? You think it's too aggressive?
Too aggressive.
She thinks it's too aggressive, but don't ask her why. How about the next question? I mean, do we believe that it's more valuable to show investors how fast you can break even, or is it more valuable to invest to maximize the value. One of the counter arguments saying that, hey, let's break even as quickly as possible is, well, maybe you're taking away from the spend that you should have been putting into the asset. As Naveen mentioned earlier, right? If you're underspending on the asset just to break even, then are you maximizing the value of the asset? Or is the goal really to break even? Have any of you encountered that push and pull within any of the organizations you've been at, and have any perspectives?
The reason we ask is this is actually something that's come up quite a bit when we're working with small companies in the leadership, asking what's the balance of investing in that product, putting money in another pipeline product, trying to show the investment community what they thought that they could actually achieve from the break even. So it is something top of mind to a lot of people who have been through the process recently, at least.
I'd say another interesting data point is that of the people who did not achieve their break even, so if you were too bullish on the break even, you actually did not meet it. If you were more conservative on the break even, you, of course, surpassed the expectation. So the ones who did not meet the expectation were higher in the overall break even point, and the ones who thought that they would break even at a reasonable time, they were able to beat it. So it shows that being a little too aggressive wasn't helpful, but as long as you strike that right balance, I think 3.5 years is a pretty impressive number to be able to hit your break-even point at the emerging company level.
And a bunch of you raised your hands earlier and said that you had launched a product. So for you particularly, I mean, you must have had to make some sort of estimate on this for your investors. So how did you approach that? What was the thinking behind it when trying to, land on a number? Was it trying to get there as fast as possible, or was it or was there another reason?
Making it up as we go along.
Most of your studies on therapeutics, right? Have you done any DX and diagnosis and the tools, data analysis?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So your data are all on the therapeutics side. Have you done any DS and tools?
No, this is therapeutic right now. Yep.
Oh, first line therapy versus second line or third line therapy on the introduction.
Have we broken it between where the product is entered from a first, second, third line? We have not. These are all interesting analyses where we can certainly cut some of the data. Yeah.
3.3 years sounds very aggressive if you're talking about introducing something that's going to take a while
Go
to
up.
get first line therapy.
Right. Usually we'd expect that more of an innovative product that is going to be more standard of care pretty quickly, quicker uptake curve, would actually achieve it versus others. The mix in the main article that we had was actually there were some fully innovative products and some other later line, and there was a 505(b)(2) or a couple of them in that. I don't know the mix on these though. Yeah. Okay. So we have a few slides on the timing level and drivers of spend. So going back to the level of SG&A spend over time period. So what we did is we extracted just the biopharma executive perspective before there was the biopharma as well as the financial and advisory services perspective. We just extracted the SG&A spend for the biopharma. And if you look on the left, so this is 3 years prior, and then moving to the right, that gets to 1 year prior to launch, you see the level of spend and the threshold. So before we talked about the 75% threshold. If you look at the blue shades, you'll see the percentage that had planned spend that met or exceeded that 75%. And so we're talking in the 2 years, or the L-3 and L-2, we're talking really only about 10% or so are setting themselves up for success based off of this assessment. When you're getting to the launch year, it is jumping up a little bit more. Still pretty underfunded. And what we've seen with some of these is that jump to try to almost overspend a little bit more in the year prior to launch, but that never works. It's always what's the run up. That's what we've seen. We actually did a separate look at the companies that just spent in the first year versus the breadth and compared the level of success. And spending as much as you want in the year prior to launch does not get you to where you could have been if you had actually started spending in the 3 years prior. And then we did cut this data between biopharma executives and the financial advisory executives because what we wanted to see is what's holding back the level of spend. And this is where we're going to actually turn back to you momentarily to see if you have any perspective on it. What we're seeing is on the top are the general percentages we share. This is a slightly different cut of the data. But then on the bottom is you see actually the financial perspective is to actually spend a little bit more earlier. So if you look at the 3 years prior to launch, they actually are suggesting a planned spend which is 20% above the threshold versus the biopharma executives, closer to 10%. So that's suggesting that there's at least a desire or expectation from the financial side of spend, in that much earlier period. So it was somewhat surprising, actually, looking at that because we're trying to understand why we have this level of lack of investment early on. We did look again the slide we shared about the level of experience tied to level of investment. You do see the shift happen when you have more experience, but it's kind of interesting to see the financial perspective also. So why is there this lack of spend, or what's driving overall SG&A spend? These data are actually going to be coming from one of the surveys that we conducted. Before we go into the data, I just want to share what the criteria were that we received from the respondents around what they were focused on. So product potential as one big factor, and the product potential looking really at the size of the financial opportunity, if you will, for that particular product. The company financial situation, the overall funding and aptitude to spend, the perceived level of development risk, and this is going to play a big factor looking at the level of kind of technical, regulatory probability of success. Corporate goals. Do you plan to commercialize yourselves? Do you plan to find a partner? Do you plan to have some other type of kind of transaction? Well, does impact. The disease state, whether it's specialty, if it's a primary, and the span of the types of customers. And then lastly, competitive landscape. The competitive landscape is very much tied to the product potential. With the competitive landscape, it's a lot around not only the level of share of voice you're going to need in order to compete in the market, but also the level of differentiation that's more achievable. So based off of those views, we asked the latest round of participants to rate the factors by the L-3, L-2, and the year prior to launch. And what you see is development risk is the most important in the year 3 and year 2 prior to launch. Product potential is also very high in those periods. And then once you get, usually around the year prior to launch is when your pivotal data is going to be coming in, you're filing, so you have you really know what your probability of regulatory and technical success is, so that drops down. And then the product potential and the competitive landscape, which is what we said are very tied, those really rise up. One other that seems kind of pretty interesting in this is the company finances. So if you look at 3 years prior, say, why would company finances not be one of the overriding factors about your spend? I think what it is the companies are not spending that much in the 3 years prior to launch, so they're not as concerned. If you're actually spending to what we feel is the minimum threshold to be successful, I would envision this actually popping up to what it looks like more in the 2 and 1 year prior to launch, where we are seeing the spend increase to a degree and certainly the level of focus on the company finances.
One comment just to add here. As Naveen mentioned, we noticed that in L-1, the development risk goes way down, right? Because at that point, we've assumed that we've completed our development and we're in the filing stages. But I think it's just as important to recognize that while development risk may have gone down, it's still important to plan for at least think about what may happen if you don't get an approval, right? How often do we go in with just planning for launch, and completely forgetting about, okay, what happens if we get a CRL? What happens if we're delayed 6 months or 12 months? Do we have any contingency plans in place? I think we've been in numerous company launches, even in the past year, where they said, let's go full force, we're going to get approval. And right down to the minute, they thought, all right, maybe we should think what happens if we don't get approval, just in case. And as they were starting to plan, they got a CRL. But at that point, it's a little bit too late, right? Because you can't do anything, when it's only a couple of months away. If you're 1 year out, 2 years out, you can at least build your contingency plan in advance and be able to act accordingly and be able to set all the wheels in motion at that point in time.
Thank you, Michael. So, Sachin, you take these.
So once again, I mean, I know we're presenting a lot of information. There's a lot to digest, but once again, I want to open it up to the audience to see what are some of the factors that are driving the spend in your organizations. What are the things that you're thinking about, or at least what's holding you back from spending more on launch earlier? So is everyone spending 75% of their year one forecast at L-3?
Support to parent company.
Yeah.
If it's bigger, we spend more.
That is challenging, but I mean, it's always a challenge, right? I mean, every company has budget constraints, but is there any way to kind of convince them that it's needed, right? Because you are sacrificing, well, based on this data, companies tend to sacrifice a little bit of success, right, in order to save money or stage gate their spend. So, I know there's a lot of trade-offs that are made. So what are some of the things that you're thinking about and trade-offs that you make when you have those discussions with the parent company regarding launch spend?
We discuss, but compared to discuss with other investors, it is easier to persuade the parent company. So
and persuading the parent company to make sure that they're getting enough funding for that launch.
These type of data that we're sharing, I mean, one of the reasons for this is hopefully these will help be arguments that you can also make to some of your investors and leadership that you do need to make this level of spend early enough.
So as someone that's done a lot of commercial launches on both big pharma side and biotechs, I see a drastic difference between those two industries. And big pharma now knows that, you really have to maximize every approval that there is. So they now know that you need to expend, you have one chance to go to bat for a market, and you have one chance to have a leadership position, and you may have 5 drugs in the pipeline and one gets approved. So your entire corporate revenue is dependent on that. So for that reason, they can and do invest as early as possible if they're educated and know better to do that, because they know that drug launch, and you talk about breaking even, the breaking even doesn't matter because you really have, it's 1 year post-launch that you have a chance to resume a market leadership position, and 2, to adopt with mid to late adopters. And if you don't do that, year 3 isn't going to happen. So biotech companies don't realize that for the most part, because if you look at their board and you look at their leadership, it's mostly heavily weighted to scientists, people that are doing the clinical studies, and there isn't that knowledge about the importance of commercialization.
Yeah.
So I say, breakthrough molecules don't just market themselves. You need a breakthrough conversation and a breakthrough innovation of the very essence of how people think of medicine and how they treat in order to create that opening. So it just doesn't happen because who's sitting on the board and who is sitting in the C-suite. So there isn't even the conversation, and the commercial person isn't even brought in until a year before launch.
That's true.
Don't you think that makes a difference in the forecast too? Because usually when you're
Yeah, it's not even, so that's the disparity too. All the money goes into the clinical studies, and that commercial expertise isn't even brought in, even on the board.
Yep.
I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier around the evidence for reimbursement needed and the lack
Yeah.
of that, right? I think that's the big gap there, where you're not going to be able to achieve it because approval's not the finish line. Everyone
Yeah.
thinks that, right? And it's not even just getting the reimbursement, it's getting uptake, particularly in the competitive market,
Yep.
and getting physician behavior to change. So I think that's that gap you were talking about that needs to be filled.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was trying to find one of the slides, but I'll just speak to it. The comment that you had made around the board members and the leadership as being development, I think it's probably one of the biggest challenges we see with organizations trying to get that spend. They don't get the chief commercial officer or head of commercial in until a year before launch. Actually, it's actually flipped to what you would expect. There's often more of the junior marketers, the junior commercial people are brought on to help keep things going, and then they bring in the leadership very late. But the people who are brought on are not able to really inform all of the decisions that need to be made, and they don't have the the standing with the board, if you will, to actually enact change. And so you don't spend until this chief commercial officer comes on, which is a year prior to launch, unfortunately. And then you see you're just trying to make up all of that you can in that 1 year prior to launch, and that's just never a recipe for success. Okay, last topic here is around where is the spend going from a commercial perspective. So in our latest survey, we asked the participants to rank where they feel that they're underspending the most. And so it might be difficult for you to see, so I'll just call out what the different colors are. So on the bottom of each of these, in the lightest orange is underinvested. In the next bucket is invested too late. The next one is then a combination of either underinvesting or investing too late. And then the gray area is actually where they said that there was adequate investment. So just across the board, you can see that most of the leaders actually felt that they did underinvest across all of these commercialization functions. Kind of going a little bit deeper into them, if you look at the handful on the right of this chart, IT, supply chain, HR, legal compliance, and finance, those are ones where there's the strongest feeling that there was at least mostly an adequate level of investment. And most of these are because these functions are existing within each company prior to thinking about commercialization, right? They're, as part of a development company, you're going to have your IT infrastructure, you're going to have some level of HR, legal compliance. We'll say a lot of launches we see do fail because of these kind of corporate type functions with the organization thinking that they're ready, but then not recognizing that there needs to be another level of expertise on each of these functions when it gets to commercialization. But that's one kind of insight that we gleaned from this. Another is if you look at the next handful where you see things such as branded marketing, sales, medical affairs, these are what I'll call a lot of the core commercial and commercialization buckets. There is still that strong feeling that there is not adequate funding across those, which is pretty interesting. The ones that really did jump out, though, are on the left two on the right, which are market access and corporate communications. If you remember me at the beginning of this presentation, we were talking about market access and the importance of market access. It brings right back up here, it comes up here as one of the areas of highest underfunding. And I think that underfunding is the perspective that when they're actually getting to market, they're recognizing that not everything was done that could have been done. And a lot of that goes back into development and saying, are we thinking about the health economics, outcomes research type endpoints that need to go into our trials, real world evidence that's going to need to come through. And then a lot of the planning for things such as overall reimbursement or coding and all of that. And those are very technical areas that if you don't have that well thought out and done early enough, it's an easy miss. And a lot of organizations are missing that. If we think about even why launches miss forecasts, that was one of the biggest reasons. It was the whole market access piece. The second one is corporate communications. So this is particularly with emerging companies. Corporate communications is an area that we're seeing much higher focus being placed on, an area where some companies are really missing the ball. not investing in it early enough, not placing kind of a level of strategic importance on it, especially when the whole goal of an emerging company is not only to certainly, when appropriate, is to promote the product or promote the MOA, but it's to actually create the story of the company and promote the company because you're launching the company while you're launching the product. And that is a part that's often done too late. And then the adoption curve, there's little corporate or brand awareness, and the adoption curve is much lower than expected. So that is a big piece. And then the one element that also cuts across those two is pricing. In this in the world we live, in the high prices of a lot of the premiums that companies are trying to charge for the products, this is a piece that not only has to be very tight on the market access side, but from a corporate communication side. If I go back probably even a few years ago, a lot of companies were just waiting to almost drop their price right before launch and just say, this is what our price is. What companies are doing now, especially those that are kind of launching with the premium product, they're trying to sensitize the market a bit more earlier so that when the product does actually get launched, there's not this shock and awe. And it's allowing a little bit of the information to absorb in the marketplace. And that's what a strong corporate communication strategy can do for you. Any questions on these data?
The one thing I was going to add, Naveen, is if you look, the third one from the left, also an interesting one is unbranded marketing. Unbranded marketing, if you look, it's 35% is invested too late. That's the highest among the group. And so that's an interesting one, right? Because if you think unbranded marketing doesn't really come to mind when you think about where did you miss in terms of spend. But the majority of the people indicated that for unbranded marketing, if there's a need to do unbranded marketing, the majority of the time you're doing it too late. Right, so that goes back to delaying spend and pushing and pushing and pushing. When you're in that, L-6 months to 1 year period, it may be too late for unbranded marketing, right? Because you're so close to the marketing campaign already that what is the purpose of adding additional spend on the unbranded, or it may be too late to create the market awareness that you need so that you can have that successful launch when time comes in. So that was another big one that popped up in the survey.
Any perspectives or comments on that? Yes.
So I agree. Unbranded marketing should happen, 1 to 2 years before the approval of the launch. That's ideal. But if you look at Keytruda, for instance, so I was involved in Keytruda at phase 1 approval. So we didn't have time for unbranded marketing. What is unbranded marketing? It's basically disease state awareness. What is it that created that market? It was immuno-oncology. Keytruda is secondary, and Opdivo was secondary. So it's true carved out unbranded disease state awareness, creating an excitement around the unmet need. That's really what disease awareness or unbranded marketing is. So that's, I would say, even more important when you're in an innovative category because you're carving out the future, and the brand is the solution.
Yep,
Yeah, very
well
true.
said. Any other questions or perspectives on these data? Any surprises? Yes.
Yeah, just for the marketing aspect, did you look at any carve out how the marketing spend was made? Was it what type of media?
Not as part of this. I think we have other, and if we can follow up with you, we have other data that shows where marketing spend will go. Absolutely, but it was not part of this. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
As part of your evaluation, did you look at time to launch? Meaning, are you a first in class? Are you a me too? Or are you second? How does that forecasting?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We looked at the data set that we had, especially from those 19 or 20 companies, and it just, after a quick qualitative look, companies that are second to market, third to market, or in an existing class tended to have slightly smaller spend. More innovative companies, one of the rare disease actually, even though it was a rare disease, it was a bigger rare disease, one of the highest price ones, so you can probably glean what that was. Those were the ones that were actually on the top of the overall spend. But we did see some of that dispersion as you would expect. But there were some where we actually looked and said, these companies are pretty similar from like at least an archetype perspective, seeing very different spends, meaning that there was something else going on in that organization, whether it was a more aggressive company versus conservative or other dynamics that we just didn't have access to. Any other questions? Well, that concludes all of the data that we had. If there's any other things, feel free to pop by and ask us questions. We hope you enjoyed, and we'll make this all available as well. If you give us your business cards, we can certainly kind of send off the presentation with all of the data to you as well. And you also have a version of the first article that we did on the table, as well as another Dealmakers study. Okay? Well, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.